Making media or art means fighting for people's attention.
We're now stranded on this deserted island in the middle of the ocean.
Okay, I got to see something really cool.
Boys!
Once you notice it, it's everywhere. And that's assuming you didn't probably already know about it. So why is this such a thing? 1 in 4 streams on Spotify are skipped within the first 5 seconds. 30% of people in my most recent video stopped watching by 30 seconds. And because of this, all these rules are created for both consumers and artists, like the 3-episode rule in anime or the 17-page rule in screenwriting, or even the fact that one of the first things you're taught when learning how to write an essay in school is to create a hook. My name is Pei, and today we're talking about how Frieren Beyond Journey's End promised its entire season in 3 episodes. One of the things I love most about art is that it's not a zero-sum game. In sports or competition, for one person to win, another has to lose. In some cases, it's even more extreme than that, like a championship, for example. One team wins, many lose. However, art's only limitation is the attention people are willing to give it, and then theoretically, the ultimate amount of time people have in the day. We're far from the finite limitations of human consumption. With more good art that's made, people will consume more, which means collaboration is encouraged. People can build off one another. And while making art can feel incredibly competitive, there's room for the entire graph to grow. So I believe one of the main factors in what determines an audience's ability to pay attention to a piece of art is the quality. And one of the first things you learn about quality in art is maintaining audience's attention. Ask many established YouTubers what the most important parts of a video are, and near the top will always be the thumbnail, title, and intro, which kind of leads us to the consumer's perspective. How long do you give a series before you give up on it? Well, there's a popular rule in the anime community that you should give a series 3 episodes before you decide it's not for you. The origin of this rule, at least according to Screen Rant, was that with the release of Madoka Magica, a very popular anime series, people argued you should give it at least 3 episodes to win you over because there's a pretty intense tonal shift. And if you were to give up too early, you might miss out on what the show actually is. This actually ties into a concept that the author and educator Brandon Sanderson talks about a lot. I bring up this guy constantly in my videos because I love his framework for storytelling. When I was dedicating a lot of energy to improving my writing, I kept coming back to his online lectures. So let's talk about one of his lessons, specifically this idea of promises. There's this unspoken contract between an audience and a creator. Audiences are essentially suspending their disbelief and giving the creator their attention on the basis that the story they're consuming is going to be a satisfying watch. This applies to all sorts of pieces of media. Articles, YouTube videos, books, movies, shows. It's the entire premise of clickbait. And what differentiates good from bad clickbait is whether or not they follow through on the promise that initially captured your attention. Like I said, is the viewing experience satisfying? Veritasium actually has a fantastic video on this because creators are making promises. And if you take too long to get to those promises, people will click away before they realize what the story is. Take for example the 17-page rule, which is a guide for screenwriters to get to the inciting incident in a story by 17 pages, or translated to film, 17 minutes. This rule isn't absolute, it's broken constantly, but generally speaking, it's great advice for writers to get to the central conflict of a story pretty quickly. It's the reason why every fantasy novel that follows some insignificant character who's going to have some life-changing exposure to magic starts with a preface where there's an intense battle between monsters and heroes. Because a couple chapters of a rather insignificant lifestyle of the main character that will be flipped on its head in the hero's journey doesn't necessarily represent the grand adventure that the story is going to tell. So let's apply what we just talked about to Frieren, starting first with a question. Does this story make a promise as to what the series will be by 3 episodes? Yes, absolutely. And today I'm going to explain why. So let's simplify all of the first season of Frieren into 3 major promises. Frieren starts with subversion, beginning at the end of the hero's journey. We're given a slow and emotionally deep story. We're introduced to a magical world. And this episode ends setting up the closest thing to what the show has to an overarching conflict. In losing Himmel, Frieren realizes she regrets the way she spent her time with him. Episode 1 ends with the inciting incident, which is actually a very common strategy for screenwriting for television. In episode 2, we go a different direction, exploring an entire story that could work as a standalone. We're introduced to Frieren, one of the main characters of the series, and we even get the opportunity to see her grow up in front of us. And that's only the first half of the second episode. And in the second half of episode 2, we're introduced to the first of Frieren and Fern's meandering adventures. These 2 episodes set up 2.5 of the promises that I talked about earlier. The first promise is that this is a story that's going to explore complex character relationships and development. This is expressed through Frieren's reaction to the loss of Himmel, the way Frieren, Hyder, and Frieren all navigate the complex situation of Hyder's impending death, and the moment where Frieren feels the need to confront Frieren with the way that they're using their time. The search for Blue Moonweed also showcases Frieren's attempt to process and understand the way she feels about her relationship with Himmel from her previous adventure. The second promise is that this series is going to build and take place in a beautiful fantasy world. Everything from the outstanding art direction, the incredibly interesting magic system, and the subtle but overwhelmingly effective way in which the story shows the audience that there's a world that exists so far beyond the frame we're allowed to see. And finally, the third promise, that this story is going to be filled with meandering adventures that sometimes are fantastic. Episode 1 and 2 fulfill 2.5 of these promises, but they're missing a major component of what makes this story so special, which is its ability to go big when it needs to. This isn't an action-first story, but my god, when they choose to go there, they do a fantastic job. And it's a crucial, fundamental part of what makes this show so good. We don't fully understand that this is going to be a proponent of the show until episode 3 comes along. This episode starts off very slow. Convinced that Frieren's lying to her, Fern secretly follows Frieren around in this beautifully established seaside town, which leads to this remarkably cute moment where it's revealed that Frieren was trying to find a way to celebrate Fern's birthday, in both getting her a gift and finding a sweet shop for them to go eat at. She gives Fern a silver butterfly hair ornament, tying beautifully into the end of episode 2. It's slow and solid, and I think it really sets up the second half of episode 3. We then have the opportunity to see Frieren teaching Fern magic. Something that's very tricky to do well in storytelling is to find clever ways to include exposition. One effective way to approach exposition is to try to create storytelling components that are multifaceted. Sneak the exposition into something that is already relevant to what's going on. One of the most obvious examples of this is when a character doesn't know something about the world that the audience also needs to learn. So in another character teaching them, the audience gets the information they need. It's remarkably easy to do this poorly. It can feel obvious and long-winded. It happens constantly in sports anime, but Frieren does a fantastic job. They withhold information, but then hint at it multiple times. For example, Fern's supposed to be reading this history tome, but she keeps on putting it off. And by the time we get to the end of the episode, we have the exact same experience that Fern does, which is essentially that the exposition for this world is going to be super interesting. It's an outstanding example of show, don't tell. Which leads us to this series' first of many fantastic peaks. Moments that are beyond just an emotional magnitude. Big, beautifully executed scenes. This one is centered around one of the few remaining generals of the Demon King's army. A mage so powerful that Frieren couldn't defeat him, forced instead to seal him away. Now 80 years later, she's returned to resolve this threat. This scene is just fantastic. The sound design, the music, the animation. It's not the biggest moment in the show, but it was the first time I realized how remarkable the big moments would be. It's just so good. And not only does it fulfill the last part of the third promise, the grandiose part of those meandering adventures, it also does a fantastic job in world building. Fern being there and Frieren showcasing why she taught the lessons she did. This scene isn't just fantastic, it's an incredible capstone to all 3 of the promises that I posited in this video. Everything surrounding the development of Zoltrak and it becoming basic offensive magic. It's hard for me to properly express how strong I think the writing is here. It ties into bigger themes in the story, like how fast humans develop. And it all ends with one of my favorite shots of Frieren's first 3 episodes. The demon slowly fading away, Frieren's spell having blasted a hole through him and the cliffside behind him, revealing the water below. And then we see a shot of Frieren hovering above him. This series has quickly solidified itself as one of my favorite shows, and its first 3 episodes are outstanding. Thank you for watching. This is the 4th video in a running series where I'm going through Frieren episode by episode and analyzing it. If you enjoyed it, consider checking out any of the other 3 I've done. If you want to support me or the series, I have a Patreon with 4 exclusive video essays up now. There'll be a link in the description. Thanks, I'll see you next week.